the best.
Hello, everyone. We are going to begin our panel on platform nations, the battle between the old giants and the new. I have a distinguished panel of experts here with me. I have Mr. James Appathurai, the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges from NATO. I have Mr. Aprameya Radhakrishnan, the CEO and founder of KOO, an innovative new platform from India. And we have Lydia Kostopoulos, who is from the US Joint Special Ops University, USSOCOM, and an old friend with whom I'm looking forward to interacting on this panel. We were hoping that Ambassador Anne-Marie Larsen, the tech ambassador from Denmark, would be able to join us, and we're still hoping she would be able to join us in the course of the call. But let me begin, with a general question to my distinguished panelists. Firstly, the background. The old giants, governments or nation states, are now pursuing legal and administrative action to control and regulate what I call the new giants, the tech companies and platforms that now dominate our lives. The struggle is focused, of course, on data flows and their economic value. Let me put some general questions first to all three of our panelists. How can governments and the tech firms balance their needs for control and freedom of expression and user privacy, respectively? In this borderless world of social media, can self-regulation even work? And finally, how can state actions to use social media for their political and electoral gains be dealt with? In particular, I'm addressing the question of surveillance. How can both the old and the new giants come together to restore trust in our users? James, if I may, I'm going to kick off with you. Could you give us some general ideas on these driving questions?
Sure, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. These are questions which we look at quite deeply here at NATO, but I want to put it into the context in which we look at it, and everybody's got a different perspective. But increasingly and unfortunately, we have to look at this from a NATO point of view in terms of competition between value systems. So, you framed it as governments and tech companies, but we look at it predominantly as a value system versus a value system, and it's ours versus others, and in particular, to be very blunt about it, a more autocratic model where technology and surveillance is being used against the citizens of those countries in a very concrete way, and I'll give you very clear examples of that, but where those countries that propagate that system are trying to spread the norms that they use to all of us. So you quite rightly talked about industry and the importance of industry. What's very clear is that industry runs the technology and the platforms on which governments rely and which our populations rely. So this really has to be a team effort between governments and industry in the West. You asked if self-regulation is possible. I think we all recognize that right now, particularly social media platforms are being instrumentalized in the democratic world by non-democratic countries to do a few things. One is to create political division, and very often what is being done is to manipulate social media, not to invent social division, but to exacerbate existing social divisions, to take existing problems, make them worse. But secondly, to call into question the effectiveness of the democratic system. And third, to call into question truth itself, so that people don't know what's true or not anymore, and they just give up trying to figure out what's true. There's this famous book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which is based on the Russian playbook, and it's what we see now being played out elsewhere. So that's a sort of clear strategy by autocratic systems into our systems, and we need to push back on that very strongly. And you mentioned, the borderless social media. What I have heard and been reported to is that, for example, some countries are using social media in Mexico to influence the Spanish language population in the United States. So it's a very effective way. That's where they're getting their news. And it's not necessarily regulated in the same way as it is in the United States. So this is a very important issue, and we need the companies to take active, concrete measures to ensure the maximum possible hygiene on their own systems. And then you talked about surveillance, and then I'll come to an end for my opening remarks. This is really a major concern. And the ultimate example of this is now playing itself out in China, where, this is the famous example now. If you start to jaywalk across the street in Shenzhen, by the time you've crossed the street, a camera has recorded it. Money has been taken off your account through your social media account. You have lost points on your state point system, your social value, and you might have your face up on an electronic billboard already for having committed a crime and in order to shame you. This isn't just a problem in China. What we see is China exporting surveillance technology and software, including facial recognition software, which reinforces autocracies around the world. And there are, I think, well-founded reports, for example, of Chinese technicians in Myanmar after the coup helping to install this new technology. So this is a real concern. Just to conclude, what do we need to do about it? Well, at NATO, we've taken the decision that not only NATO countries, but also our partner countries that are democracies need to sit together, figure out what's happening, and have coherent positions in the international bodies that set standards, for example, on cybersecurity, 5G, 6G at the International Telecommunications Union, when it comes to the ethical use of artificial intelligence or data exploitation. You will see in a few days that we will publish standards that we intend to use in these areas. So, and we need to work more closely with tech companies, and we're doing that as well, including to get alerts from them when there are cyber attacks against our systems, because they know first. So there's a lot going on here. We share this concern, and it's only going to get worse, so we need to do more to deal with it.
Thank you so much, James. And if I may now, I'll move to Aprameya from KU to get a viewpoint from the industry. So over to you, Aprameya.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here on the show. So I think running a successful social media company in any part of the world is basically a three-legged table, right? It's like a balance between users, the government, and the platform itself. And as soon as one of them get tilted, the table becomes unstable, right? So it is a constant dialogue that is required. And in most cases, society, the community, and technology will always be ahead of what the government will be thinking, right? So they will always play catch up to whatever the society and technology are figuring out. But at the same time, social media companies have a limited responsibility towards the user, which is, I will allow you freedom of expression, right? I will allow you to connect. I will allow you to communicate with others. But the governments in reality actually have a lot more, they're a lot more answerable to their citizens because they're responsible for education, jobs, healthcare, a lot more things. So I think, it has to be a constant dialogue between all three parties with the user as the most prominent person to take care of. And the way to make sure that happens is transparency. There is no other way. So if the government is asking for too much surveillance, it has to be declared by the social media platform as to what has been shared. right? So that the user knows what the particular government of that country is trying to do, right? And at the same time, if there's too much of influence on a particular country with centralized global laws by a global giant, let's say, that is also essential to be made transparent by the platforms, so that users can again judge whether this is good or not for them. Like for example, at Coup, we are taking a very decentralized approach to running social media platforms. We started in India. We are trying to understand the local law of the land and building social media around it. Where we've just about entered Nigeria, and we're trying to make sure that Nigeria and the government of Nigeria is comfortable with Coup's entry into Nigeria. So it's a constant dialogue, and the what makes people doubt or users doubt a platform is when there is lack of transparency. Then that is what we're trying to build and make sure that users always know what is happening, either from the government or the platform itself, and take a conscious call on what they're using.
Thank you so much. That was, I think, a very succinct summing up of, and I think I'm glad you put the users at the center of the question, because so often we get caught up in the struggle between governments and industry that we forget that the user, the ultimate user, is the key to many of these issues. So, Lydia, if I can move on to you, you have the driving questions, and I know you have a lot of strong views on them. So please do go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's also nice to go last on this. I like to piggyback on what James said around values. And I do think from a government perspective, in regards to regulation, you will see national values come into play. But ultimately, I do think we need to look at algorithmic incentives and understand that when we talk about social media platforms, these are organizations that are profit-based. They are not nonprofits. And we have to understand how it is they derive profit and how they give back to their shareholders. In that sense, I think we bring in society, which is what Aprameya was saying, that we bring society into this conversation and understand where we stand today. Our values as societies, regardless of country, are evolving very rapidly right now. And that's because of emerging technologies changing how we interact with each other, where we derive our value, how we generate income. And just like in any other time in history, our social values change with that. And because it's such a dynamic moment, I think it's important to bring in society into that regulatory conversation with government and social media to say, well, where is the right place? Where do we stand? And so, for example, there are many NGOs that are doing deep thinking on these issues around what it means for children and minors. I know with the recent whistleblower from Facebook, she talked about how Facebook was aware that Instagram was creating a lot of negative feelings amongst teens, particularly female teens, and how they were having increasingly suicidal thoughts because of the way that the platform's algorithms were incentivized to show them certain content that generated these kinds of psychological outcomes. And so I think that if we see that technology is moving so fast, we can also appreciate that political leaders are challenged to keep up with this. And it's we are all challenged, even as a society. And that's all the more reason why we need to collectively come to the table together. And I would also add that there are some countries, Sweden, for example, that has a minister for the future. And I think that this is a very important and forward-leaning concept to say that there is someone who is a stakeholder holding the voice for the people of the future and looking ahead to not just looking at today's problems right now, but saying, well, what are the ramifications and the impact of our decisions today for people in the future, whether it be climate change or any other technological impact. And I think that is a progressive way to start also thinking about our problem sets. In regards to trust, I think that we need to, around data security is kind of where I think the trust piece is really important. We talk about who are the third parties that have access to our data. how are they using that for advertising? Also, how are breaches being dealt with? And I think that in that regard, we need to, one, have agency as users, and two, organizations need to be transparent, as Aprameya said, about how the data is being used. And then also, then the government should come in to say, is this correct? Is this ethical? And then go back to the question of who should have rights to that data? If I am generating data on the platform, do I have rights to be able to sell my own data for myself? And lastly, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, we need to understand that data breaches happen every single day, and that we need to think about risk mitigation and risk management instead of 100% security. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you, Lydia. If I may go back to you now, James, you know, I want to put a specific question to you about NATO and what NATO is doing in this area. As I said, you know, as you said as well, you know, NATO is essentially a political military alliance, right? And so how do you see its role in regulating social media, if at all? And specifically, how can NATO work at bringing tech innovators and governments together? Do you have a specific program for this, or and can this model be useful to create global networks?
So thanks for that question. To be direct, we don't see any role for NATO in regulating social media. I want to be very clear about that. That's for national governments and international bodies, other international norm-setting bodies to do. But we are an alliance of democracies, and they do talk here about how to protect the integrity of the democratic system, but what they do elsewhere in this regard is not NATO's business. But what we are doing is two things. One is helping to build stronger relationships with innovators. And of course, I mean industry, and that includes, yes, big industry, but it also increasingly means startups, small and medium sized enterprises that are not necessarily engaged with governments, that are not necessarily engaged with the defense and security community, but which we think should be, and I'll say why. First, because we need to maintain our technological edge here in the West, in NATO, because we are in a situation where our well, sometimes adversaries, but certainly other countries, have systems in place whereby they are, by law, taking the data that passes through their companies. They are, by law, having access to dual-use technology, which startups create. China calls this military civil fusion. Anybody can look it up. But while our companies are quite rightly, I think, very independent from government, Chinese companies aren't. And so in order to maintain our edge, we need to build a stronger relationship of trust. You started with the word trust, and we need to build that again. We used to have it, I think, 30, 40 years ago. Now I think the two communities have grown apart. We need to bring them back together. So we're creating a defense innovation ecosystem in NATO, and you'll see in the next few days some NATO defense ministers signing a declaration of intent to help fund this, bringing together governments and startups in particular to help them understand us, to help us and them develop together technologies which we can access, dual-use technologies in particular, which we can access for our needs, but also to help them fund and bring to market their products. So that's one area where we think there's a real growth potential, and we want to do that. Second is we're trying to promote resilience in the private sector. And what do I mean by that? I mean a few things. One is to make the cyber infrastructure stronger. There are far too many breaches. Breaches meaning attacks from outside of the NATO territory, which are accessing data, sometimes sensitive data, always personal data. So companies really need to invest more in the security of the cyber infrastructure because they're the ones who run the cyber infrastructure. Second, they need to build resilience when it comes to protecting sensitive technologies. What's happening, in my country, Canada, and across the alliance is small companies that are facing financial difficulty find very often someone from somewhere else standing with a check. And even if they don't want to sell, the CEO will have a fiduciary responsibility to sell, responsibility to their shareholders. And what happens? Sensitive technologies get put in the hands of countries that should not have those sensitive technologies we developed and which we will no longer have access to. Then we come to data protection. We've already discussed that. Private companies need to invest in data protection. So there's really a lot that needs to be done. And finally, I would say, and this comes back to Mr. Radhakrishnan's comment, and I'm just going to put this on the table. This is not a NATO position, but I'll just say it from my own perspective. To what extent do companies in the democratic world need to also take financially difficult responsibilities to uphold values, including, for example, yes, the algorithm, but also where they operate? So, Microsoft has had its complications with the EU, but I know that Microsoft just recently took the decision to pull LinkedIn out of China. And that cost them a whole lot of money, but they did it because they didn't feel that they could operate in China anymore according to the rules that the government set there. And companies have a lot of difficulty in Russia for reasons that are fully in line with the law of the land of Russia and of the law of the land in China, but are not in line with Western values. So the question is, I put back to colleagues, at what point can companies say, we're just a private company and we're focused on the user? Sorry, I'm not coming after you at all. That's not what I mean. But just to say, these are questions that I think we all need to address. It's not just about profit. It's not just about the user. It's also about values. And these are discussions that I think we all need to have together. We can't impose it at NATO, and we don't want to. But we definitely want to have the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to move to Aprameya now. We'd like to hear a lot more about what KU is doing. In a sense, what I see the KU platform achieving is positioning itself as an innovator among the new giants, if I may put it that way, or the existing global platforms. Your emphasis on local languages, digital literacy, microblogging, and the speech-to-text features, very important for developing countries, make you a unique platform in that sense. And of course, it's a welcome development to have a platform created and active in the global south. And you have, I understand, over 10 million users now, if I'm not mistaken, and you're doing your work in 9 different languages. What did you and your colleagues hope to achieve by creating this platform? And do you see it being able to become a global model for other countries in the global south?
Yeah, absolutely. So our premise for existence in a world of so many global tech giants is the fact that we are building an India-first approach to expression, right? So in India, less than 1 to 2% of the country actually is very fluent with English, that they can actually speak and go and express themselves on an international microblogging platform or any other social media platform, right? Which means that while there are 700 million people who have access to internet on their phone, very few actually go and say what they have on their minds, and they're not using existing platforms because they don't feel that the people on those platforms or the topics that are being discussed, or even if you look at hashtags that are trending, are all very alien to them. So they're not looking for global connect. They're looking for local connect. They're looking for local topics. They're looking for local people to discuss their problems with. And making it available and accessible in local language and building technology to make expression in local language easier is what we are trying to do. Right? Even so, India is a very unique country where the topmost layer, educated, super achieved individuals are connected globally through global social media platforms. But when they have to express deeper, they have not, been in the habit of expressing in local language. Who is helping the topmost people of India to express in local language so that their thoughts can percolate to the grassroots. The grassroots now can learn, accelerate their personal development by knowing about how to live better, how to be better, right? And also express themselves in local language. So that is extremely critical for a country like India. And I think there are several countries across the world which have a similar demographic, where the topmost 5% will be English speaking and connected globally, but the 90-95% of the rest of the country will actually be very locally focused, right? So I think KU, using its unique value proposition of language, expression in language, and connecting every country deeper in terms of daily expression, can go beyond India. It can go to Indonesia, it can go to Malaysia, Philippines, countries in Africa like Nigeria. So everywhere there is a need for local language, and using local language, you now help people promote and keep their local culture as well. So when you talk in local language, you promote local culture as well. So while there is a global approach to, okay, here's the global citizen, there will be a bottom-up approach of my culture, my individuality also. So that is where KU is coming into picture, and hopefully will be successful outside India as well.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Lydia, moving to you. I understand your values align, and you made this very clear, with those of liberal democracies and human rights. What are your feelings on the various issues we've discussed today? Is self-regulation viable at all? How do we make the dialogue more inclusive and bring in all stakeholders, for example? And particularly the standard-setting bodies and the technology groups, which I don't think we've really addressed in any detail. The technology is rapidly mutating, emerging, and evolving. How do we deal with the ethical implications of how these technologies work? And finally, how do we achieve risk mitigation and resilience and increase trust? I come back to this question of trust, and I just wanted to mention to you that the Singapore minister in the inaugural session actually said that it's come down from 77% to 68%. Now, when you think about it, that's not a huge fall. So are we perhaps overestimating how much fear and lack of trust there is in technology? There is a real question here. And I'm sorry to do this to you, Lydia, but I'll have to ask you to give us all of this in just about 3 minutes, because we have a hard stop at 12:30. And I need to take a couple of questions from the audience. Go ahead.
You got it. Tall order, but I will do my best to deliver. I think that in the conversation around trust and around ethics, we need to start to understand that we have different generations with different generational values. And this goes across countries. And I think that this is because of the way that different generations grew up with different technologies. You can see already Generation Z across the world. They call it the Greta generation, who around the world have decided to protest on Fridays about climate change. These are values that this younger generation has, where they see things from a community level. And as they start to become older and start to have more economic power in the market, you will see companies change as a byproduct. You've already seen that with millennials, where millennials were more eco-conscious and aware of, different types of plastics that were harmful and all of that. And by the time that millennials became of age, where they start to have kids, you start to find all these new products that catered to this new generation that was more conscious about eating organic and not having BPA plastic and all these other kinds of things. And so I think that in that same vein, when you see the social movement, in the US, it's very prominent where we can see Black Lives Matter, among other social movements. But these are having implications in other parts of the world because of social media, because we're seeing all these things. You can see other generations around the world that are looking, the younger ones, and saying, yes, we do believe in equality. We do believe that everyone should have a right to love who they want to love and dress the way they want to dress. And this also goes into the gender fluidity and all these other things that we can see also in Asia as well as in the US. And so I do think that companies will have to start to change. And you can see that they're changing now in regards to social movements. Either they're abstaining from commenting about them because they're not sure how it's going to hurt their brand, or they're embracing them. Either way, those are two actions that are acknowledging that there's a change happening and that they need to come with that. So I do think that we will have that ethical conversation that's kind of led by the society, and then companies will follow suit to make sure that their services are aligned with their customers. And then with trust, I think that that's how we build trust, where there's a two-way conversation between society, government, and the tech sector. So I think my minutes may be up, so I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was very, very enlightening. And I'm just going to take a couple of questions which have come in for us. Aprameya, this one is specifically for you. One man's food is another man's poison. Betting the decision only on the user will always polarize the issue. A non-invasive government control may be the need of the hour concerning data privacy, usage, and accountability. General to all of you, I completely agree on the transparency part as to how the users should be made aware of what's happening. But a lot of people don't really understand what to make of this information. Any thoughts on how people can be educated better on InfoSec regulations and need? And again, a general question to all of you. Thoughts on intermediary accountability. I know this is a whole different subject and we may not be able to get into this in details, but they do ask for any thoughts that you may have. So I'm really sorry to do this to you, but I'm going to have to give you 1 minute each to sum up on this, to answer these questions. And let me kick off with you. Sorry, I keep having difficulties with your first name, Aprameya. Radhakrishna is much easier, So Aprameya, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the first step, if it's very specific to coup, I think we're one of the few social media platforms which comes on to I go on to any news channel and say what it is. We're 1.5 years old. Our intentions are really clear on what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to bring voices of those who don't have a voice because they don't know English onto the platform as well, connecting people who know English to them as well, and educating the user, also at the same time educating the government and the key people in the government to make them understand what we are trying to do and keep them on the right? Because they have, as I was saying, they have a lot more responsibility towards the users in a larger sense. So education, healthcare, jobs, all of this is their responsibility. As social media, we should ensure that we don't come in the way of government trying to do its job well, right? At the same time, the users should be given a platform to go and express themselves, where not just the government, but everybody else also understands what's happening in the country and what's important, what's not, right? So I think it's a fine balance, and technology and society will always keep changing and becoming a different animal altogether. And that understanding of what it will become has to be given to the government. So it's a constant dialogue. I don't think there will ever be a state where we say, okay, everything is well managed, nobody has to talk to anybody. Everybody has to be in constant dialogue. And it's each one's responsibility to take a proactive, responsibility towards making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. James, if I could come to you for a general answer to some of these questions.
Sure, thanks. And I'll only address the question about education and information security. And let me propose 3 or 4 things. One is it's very important for governments to educate children and young people on how to know what they're looking at is real information. So here in Belgium, my kids get regular education in school to know what's real and what's not real, how to research it so that they don't just take everything at the surface. Second is to educate the media because they amplify what they see on social media platforms. So we had a case a few years ago where the Russian language media and actually the Russian government talked about how an ethnic Russian was raped in Germany. There were protests. It was all fake. Then they tried the same thing in Estonia, and there was just a shrug. People had been educated that this was going to come, and they shrugged it off because it wasn't true. So it can work. Third is we have to set norms and standards at the international level. And my own view is the democratic world, and that's North and South, needs to come together and set standards. And then companies should, not necessarily have that imposed on them, but work towards them. And I'm quite sure that the user, in almost any case, would prefer to work through a tech company that has adopted transparency and democratic norms and standards, because they'll feel more confidence in what they see and they won't be being surveilled, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a really mutually reinforcing positive spiral. And then finally, we need to build a much stronger dialogue between governments and tech firms. They've grown apart over many years. Now I think it's time for us all to come together, defend our systems and our values.
Thank you, James. Lydia, we're going to be closed down in 30 seconds. So any thoughts on these subjects?
Yes, I think transparency is important. I will say that the platforms do provide many, many pages of transparency about what they do, but I don't think that number of pages and legal language is helpful for informed consent. And so I do think that we need to have a language or some form of education, whether it's in a video or something, that better explains to the user what risks they're assuming, what it is that they're signing themselves up for, how their data is going to be used, but also how the algorithms work. We talk about social media in this conversation. However, this applies to healthcare and algorithms, smart cities and algorithms. There are really big implications around informed consent, around all the many new big data, algorithmic, sensor, etc., convergence of technologies that are coming into our lives.
Thank you all so much. I'm sorry to have been such a hard taskmaster or the hard task mistress on timekeeping, but we did get a little delayed starting and we did have a hard stop. So it was absolutely fascinating. I wish we could have gone on for much longer. And thank you so much for your time and sharing your views.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.